Hello, everyone. Welcome to this news event. You'll be hearing from four speakers today, and then we'll open the floor for questions during the Q&A period. The Q&A period will be for members of the media only. If you wish to ask a question, you can use the raise your hand function, and your line will be unmuted when it's your turn to ask a question. You may also use the text-based Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom window to submit any questions. Right, so as I mentioned, you'll be hearing from four speakers today. First, MV Ramana, PhD, professor and Simons Chair in Disarmament, Global and Human Security at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at the University of British Columbia. Ramana is the author of the new book, Nuclear is Not the Solution, The Folly of Atomic Power in the Age of Climate Change. A link to more information about his new book is available in the chat. Sending that right now. All right, and second, you'll hear from Dr. Amory Lovins, adjunct professor, then lecturer in civil and environmental engineering at Stanford University. Amory is co-founder and chairman emeritus of RMI, founded as Rocky Mountain Institute. Third, Tim Judson, executive director of the Nuclear Information and Resource Service, NIRS, and contributing author of the World Nuclear Industry Status Report 2024. And finally, fourth, you'll hear from Naomi Oreskes, PhD, Henry Charles Lea, Professor of the History of Science, and Affiliated Professor of Earth and Planetary Sciences at Harvard University. Naomi is the author of the best-selling book, Merchants of Doubt. So let's go ahead and start with our first speaker, MV Ramana.
Thank you very much. And I thank you all for attending. It's a pleasure to be speaking about this, though it's a topic that is of great concern. And so it's not necessarily a pleasure to be talking about the topic. The larger context in which nuclear energy is being talked about a lot in recent years is the idea that it can be a solution to climate change. And in my book, I try to explain why nuclear energy is not a solution to climate change. But before I get into that, I thought I would start by telling a little bit about the landscape of nuclear energy around the world today. Next slide, please. So next slide. If you think about nuclear power plants around the world, there are roughly around 400 odd reactors, of which some of them are not operating at this current moment because they're shut down for one reason or the other. But these reactors were built mostly in the 1970s and 1980s. The plot you're seeing here shows the list of reactors that were connected to the electricity grid by year, starting in 1954 all the way till July 1st of this year. And each year, there are some number of reactors that are connected to the grid, and there are some that are taken off because they are shut down. What you see here is that most of the reactors were connected to the grid before 1986. The maximum number of grid connections were in 1984 and 1985, when there were about 33 reactors that were connected to the grid. Ever since then, there has been a decline. And you can date that to the 1986 Chernobyl accident, though there were multiple causes for the slowdown in nuclear reactor construction. Since then, we have seen some years when actually many more reactors have been shut down than started up. The result of this pattern of startups and shutdowns is that, next slide, please, the nuclear reactor fleet has been more or less constant in terms of numbers. It's gone up a little bit and come down a little bit, but it's more or less constant since the 1990s. The other important factor you should remember about the state of nuclear power today is that constructing a reactor is a long process, and there is an enormous variation in how long reactors take to go from the start of construction, which is usually said to be when the first concrete is being poured into the ground. And the construction is set to end when the reactor is connected to the electricity grid. And what you see here are the reactors that have been built over a period of time. And you see that the period of construction has increased over a period of time, over the decades. And as I mentioned, there is enormous variation. But on a rough basis, you can assume that constructing a nuclear reactor takes about 10 years, roughly, give or take. There are going to be some reactors which are going to be built faster, but those are compensated by reactors that take much longer to build. That's why the average is around 10 years. The other thing to remember is that even if some country or some state or province decides to build a nuclear power plant, for example, I'm in the province of British Columbia in Canada, there are no operating nuclear power plants here. There is, in the upcoming election, there's one party which wants to think about and consider building nuclear power plants. But should they want to do that, there is going to be a long period before construction can actually start. They have to get the appropriate environmental clearances. They have to ensure the safety of the site. They have to find a community that is willing to live near this risky facility. After all, when we see large accidents like what happened in Chernobyl and Fukushima, the most impact, the health impacts and environmental impacts were borne by the communities that were closest to the reactor. So obviously they should be concerned about this risk, and no reactors is immune from risks of accidents. And so there is going to be a certain amount of resistance you should expect from communities to having one of these facilities near them. So that's going to take some period of time. And last but not least, it's going to take British Columbia or any other entity that is considering building a nuclear plant the time it takes to raise the tens of billions of dollars that is required to build one of these nuclear plants. And in some cases, you have to go through legislative processes to pass on the cost to taxpayers and ratepayers. All of these mean that there's going to be another period of 5 or 10 years before construction can actually start. So an entity that is thinking about building a nuclear power plant should not expect to see even the first units of electricity flow into the grid for 15 to 20 years at the very minimum. And this is something we see in the case of all recent constructions as well, whether it's in the United States or Finland or France and so on and so forth. Next slide, please. The result of all of these trends is that the share of global electricity flowing in the electricity grids around the world has been declining consistently since the mid-1990s. The maximum it ever was in 1996. It was about 17.5%. In 2023, it was barely over 9%. In contrast, modern renewables, which is mostly solar and wind, not including large hydro, as well as geothermal and biomass and so on, the share of electricity flowing to grids is increased to over 15%. If you include hydro, it's going to be even higher. If you include all of the electricity generated by solar panels on rooftops and so on and so forth, it's going to be even more. But the trends could not be more contrasting. Nuclear is declining and renewables are rising. And I think Amory will talk much more about this in his presentation. Next slide, please. So one thing that people would say when these kind of historical patterns are talked about is that, oh, these are problems of the past. We have new nuclear reactor designs and they are going to fix all of these problems. I think there is absolutely no evidence that that is going to be the case. Next slide, please. So there are two. The reactors that most often get talked about are what are called small modular reactors. And the first thing to remember is that nuclear reactor designers have to consider a number of different priorities. I talked about the high costs of reactors, so you would like to make them cheaper, but you would also like them to be at less risk of severe accidents. You would also like them to produce less radioactive waste because we have no demonstrated means of dealing with this radioactive waste. And I think Naomi will talk a little bit about that. And last but not least, there is a linkage between the capacity to the people who operate nuclear power plants and their capacity to make nuclear weapons. In other words, the linkage to nuclear weapons proliferation. And so all of these different design priorities pull in very different directions. And no single design can optimize all of them. And next slide, please. In particular, when you think about small modular reactors, the thing to remember is that on a per unit basis, whether it is unit of power capacity or electricity energy generation, they are going to be more expensive than large reactors because they lose out on what are called economies of scale. It does not take 5 times as much concrete to build a reactor that produces 5 times as much power, nor do they need 5 times as many workers. And so this is the reason why historically countries around the world started building small nuclear reactors, and then those became larger and larger because they were trying to take advantage of economies of scale. Now, when you go back to smaller reactors, you're going to lose out on those economies of scale. So small modular reactors start off at an economic disadvantage. They will also produce more spent fuel and radioactive waste, require more uranium, precisely because they are smaller. So they're going to be less efficient unless you add various other features which will drive up the cost. So for example, you could add a reflector to increase the efficiency, but that is going to drive up the cost and also produce other kinds of radioactive waste. Last slide. Sorry, a couple more slides. Yeah, the other thing which no, can you go back? The other thing we hear is that the process of learning is going to decrease the cost of nuclear reactors and make it faster to build them. But historically, if you look at the 2 countries that have built the most number of nuclear reactors, the United States and France, the cost of nuclear power plants have actually increased with time, not decreased. So learning has been negative. And also, if you're talking about small reactors having lost out on economies of scale, even if they were going to be learning under the most optimistic sort of scenarios, you will find that the number of reactors that have to be built in advance of the cost even becoming equivalent to that of large reactors is enormous. And so who is going to pay for all of these lost leaders is a question that we'll have to ask. Next slide, please. So coming back to the question of should nuclear energy be a solution to climate change, there are a variety of undesirable aspects of nuclear power that I've sort of briefly mentioned. The risk of catastrophic accidents that afflicts all nuclear reactor design. No design is going to be completely immune to the possibility that some kind of accident will result in radioactive waste being spread into the environment as a result of something that goes wrong there. The linkage with nuclear weapons is also intrinsic to nuclear power. There's historical reasons, there's geographical reasons, there are technical reasons, there are reasons having to do with training people to design and operate nuclear plants, also gives them the capacity to also work on nuclear weapons. And last but not least, the institutions that support nuclear energy tend to be also institutions that are in charge of nuclear weapons. So in the United States, it's the US Department of Energy. In India, it's the Department of Atomic Energy that oversees both nuclear weapons and nuclear energy. And last but not least, there's the production of radioactive waste, which is an inherent property of nuclear reactors. Now, there are some people who would say climate change is such a grave threat that we should overlook all of these things, but then they completely ignore the fact about whether this is a feasible solution. Next slide, please. And I've sort of briefly mentioned 2 aspects. One is that it takes a long time to build nuclear power plants, which means that it is incompatible with the kind of timeline that climate scientists and the IPCC tell us we should be on if we have to reduce our emissions to meet any kind of reasonable climate target. And secondly, these are extremely expensive. And that means you're going to lose out on the opportunity cost that would have, that what you could have gained by spreading this on other things. And I'm sure Amory will talk much more about this. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Again, that was MV Ramana. Let's proceed to our second speaker, Amory Lovins.
Thank you. Can you see the slide, the title slide?
Indeed.
Very good. Well, good day. A widespread bipartisan view holds that more nuclear power can help reduce climate change. I will show the opposite is true, and that nuclear power also has no business case or operational need, so we need not pay extra for a non-solution. Local renewable output in green should pass coal power in white next year. Last year, renewables produced 30% of the world's electricity versus nuclear's dwindling 9%. That 30 does include big hydro. The blue curve is without big hydro. The world is set to add more renewables in 5 years than in the past century, reaching 42% renewable power in 2028, 25% just in solar and wind. Exponential growth of wind, solar, electric vehicles, and batteries has made nuclear power simply irrelevant. In a good year, it adds as much output all year as renewables add every few days. Nuclear gets less than 4% as much investment as renewables. Last year, China added 292 gigawatts of solar and wind and 1 gigawatt of nuclear. The United States shows similar patterns, and after a U.S. reactor closes, renewables and efficiency, if allowed to compete, typically fill in and displace its output within a year or two. Unsubsidized renewables win because they're cheaper and getting ever cheaper still. Adding grid integration costs for all the technologies shown generally widens renewables' cost advantage. That's because fossil and nuclear plants tend to have bigger, longer, more abrupt, and far less predictable forced outages than solar and wind power, needing more and costlier backup for the same reliability. The International Energy Agency estimates 96% of new solar and onshore wind power last year was cheaper than new coal or gas power, and 3/4 beat existing fossil plants. Costs are flat for fossil power, rising for nuclear, falling for renewables, falling faster for storage. Batteries get more investment and add more capacity than nuclear. In the US, batteries nearly double each year. But renewables are only half the story. In the past 48 years, saved energy, about 2/3 due to smarter technologies, has dropped US primary energy use by 64%, with immense cumulative savings. Renewables, meanwhile, tripled, but with 26 times less cumulative impact. Renewables get nearly all the headlines because they're visible, while energy is invisible, and the energy you don't use is almost unimaginable. Yet efficient use is half of the world's historic decarbonization and at least half of future decarbonization. RMI's 2011 synthesis, Reinventing Fire, of how US electricity use could shrink by a quarter by 2050, despite all electric autos and a 2.6-fold bigger GDP, has proven quite accurate. This quadrupled electric end-use efficiency would cost 1/10 as much as the retail electricity it saves. So savings far beyond fourfold would be profitable. And the integrative design practice I teach at Stanford can now make the efficiency resource far larger still. So how should we compare different ways to power the economy? We built coal-fired power plants by counting cost but not carbon. Nuclear power is promoted by counting carbon but not cost. But to protect the climate, we must save the most carbon at the least cost and in the least time, counting all three variables, carbon and cost and time. Costly or slow options save less carbon per dollar or per year than cheaper or faster options. Nuclear power is inherently costly and slow, as we've heard, so it makes climate change worse. Now, all of the above slogans that do not compare cost and speed are like arguing that since people are hungry and hunger is urgent and caviar and rice are both food, therefore both caviar and rice are vital to reducing hunger. In reality, money and time are both limited, so our priorities in feeding people or in providing energy services must be informed by relative cost and speed, saving the most carbon per dollar and per year. And the more urgent climate change is, the more vital it is to buy the most effective solutions. Now, far from offering a solution, the world nuclear industry is dying of an incurable attack of market forces. The economic principle of opportunity cost means you cannot spend the same money on two different things at the same time. Each purchase forgoes others. So buying nuclear power displaces buying efficiency and renewables, and vice versa, so the nuclear and fossil industries strive to suppress them. US subsidies that rival construction costs are propping up existing money-losing reactors, and just the new federal nuclear subsidies added in 2021 and 2, as our next speaker will describe, could have bought over 100 gigawatts of new solar and wind capacity. That is more than the total US nuclear capacity. The nuclear industry seems to have quietly changed its business model from selling products to buying influence and sometimes legislators to harvest immense subsidies. Worldwide as well, nearly all new U.S. reactors, and true in, I think, other countries as well, pretty much throughout the world, are funded compulsorily by taxpayers or customers. Many are also shielded from competition by guaranteed sales and prices, handicapping their carbon-free competitors. So might small modular reactors compete? That takes magical thinking, and today's big reactors are the wrong competitor. Early SMRs would produce electricity at well above, probably at least twice the cost of today's light water reactors, which in turn are about 2 to 8 times costlier than modern renewables, or about 5 to 10 times costlier than efficient use. But by the time SMRs, if successful, could begin mass production, their carbon-free rivals are set to get another twofold cheaper. So just do the math. 2 times 2 to 8 times 2 means mass production must make SMRs about 8 to 32 times cheaper. That is not plausible. SMRs can't catch up because small modular renewables, which do scale down well, have decades head start in exploiting their own formidable economies of scale and learning. Novel reactor designs or fuel cycles offer no escape, because even if the minor nuclear part of the prohibitive nuclear capital cost of today's reactors were free, the non-nuclear remainder would still be about 2 to 6 times too costly. SMRs can't even be developed and scaled before the U.S. grid is decarbonized without them, so they would only divert investment, attention, talent, and time from off-the-shelf carbon-free competitors that are adding 94% of this year's new U.S. capacity and are winning more than $1 trillion of global private investment. Substituting costly, slow SMRs would thus make climate change worse and proliferation vastly worse. As Doug Parr says, nuclear power can't bridge the gap between anything and anything. It's too slow, it's too expensive, it's a massive distraction. Also, its ungraceful and failures and its inflexibility complicate modern grid operations with no special benefits. So-called baseload generation by big thermal plants, an antique honorific term, is no longer needed or economic. And here's why. The gigawatt scale grid of the state of South Australia has over 3/4 solar and wind generation, due for 100% in the next few years. In the past 24 years, solar in yellow and wind in green have displaced essentially all the coal in purple and most of the gas in brown, with very successful and lucrative stabilization by big batteries. But those are not the only option. To keep the grid reliable as it becomes renewable, we can use not only one grid flexibility resource, bulk storage in magenta at the right, but also about 10 total, sketched here conceptually in order of increasing cost. Your actual cost will vary, but bulk storage comes last, not first. It's the costliest option, so we needn't wait for a storage miracle, and the market isn't waiting. Big batteries can work great and make money, but we generally don't need them because bigger and cheaper options are ample. For example, at the far left, negawatts and the second box, flexawatts, timely use, are both about 3 times bigger than expected. Just integrating electric vehicles into the grid is a terawatt scale emergent resource. Add up this carbon-free portfolio of grid stabilization resources, and a modern renewable powered grid does not need bulk electricity storage. It does need good forecasting tools and more care, attention, and thoughtfulness. But that is a solvable and solved problem, not an insuperable obstacle. Yet we're often told that only coal, gas, and nuclear stations can keep the lights on because they're 24/7, while wind power and PVs are variable and thus supposedly unreliable. But variable does not mean unpredictable. Here's how accurately the French grid operator in a stormy winter month a decade ago forecast a day ahead the output of the country's wind farms. They would do well to forecast demand that accurately. Now Danish wind operators bid day-ahead wind power just as reliably as fossil fuel generators do. Indeed, we built the grid because no generator is 24/7. They all break. And when a giant plant fails, you can lose 1 billion watts in milliseconds, often abruptly, for weeks or months. So grids manage this intermittence by backing up failed plants with working plants. And in exactly the same way, but often at lower cost, grids can manage the forecastable variations of those variable renewables by backing them up with a portfolio of other renewables, all forecasted, integrated, and diversified by type and location. Same methods, typically lower cost. So in Texas, whose grid has no big hydro dams and is only 1% interconnected to the rest of the country, a 2050 summer week of expected loads can get much smaller and less peaky with efficient use. Then we can make, say, 86% of the annual electricity with wind and photovoltaics, 14% from dispatchable renewables. Then this 100% renewable supply can match the load by putting surplus electricity into two kinds of distributed storage that are worth buying anyway: ice storage, air conditioning, and smart charging of electric autos, then recovering that energy when needed and filling the last gaps with unobtrusively flexible demand, all with excellent economics. Some grid operators actually do such choreography today. Scotland is nearly 200% renewably powered, Denmark closing in on 100%, Germany 55%. Already they and some other European countries with modest or no hydropower meet about half to 3/4 or more of their annual electricity needs from renewables, adding little or no bulk storage, and with superior and rising reliability. For Denmark and Germany, over 5 times as good as ours in America. The 99.999% reliable former East German utility 50 Hertz was 72% renewably powered last year, and it targets 100% 8 years from now. So as my colleague Clay Stranger says, the operators have learned to run these grids the way a conductor leads a symphony orchestra. No instrument plays all the time, but the ensemble continuously creates beautiful music. Thank you. I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you again. That was Amory Lovins. Let's proceed to our third speaker, Tim Judson.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. And you can start showing the slides. Great. As Amory just indicated, we've all been hearing quite a bit about nuclear energy lately, and in particular, that it's going to be necessary to serve the climate to mitigate the climate crisis, and also that we need to be making big investments in nuclear energy. And in fact, there's been a lot of policy passed in recent years to that effect. Go to the next slide. But there are some basics of financing nuclear construction projects that are time-tested, and we've experienced them over the decades, and even most recently with the reactors that were recently completed in Georgia. And so what we know are several things. One is that the first thing is that nuclear construction is extremely expensive. Secondly, that the cost increases and delays are expected in these projects. You'll see even proponents of nuclear energy acknowledging that. But the projects must appear to be economical at the start. And a recent report published by DOE this week acknowledged that most nuclear projects start with underestimated construction costs. And the reason for that is that if an accurate cost estimate were provided at the start, then no one would approve these projects for construction. Nuclear projects are large and complicated, and they take a long time to build. And in fact, the delays in construction compound the cost increases because the interest rates on the loans, really start to increase the overall cost of the project. However, governments do not let utilities go bankrupt in most cases. There's good reasons for that, but in the case of projects like the Vogtle project, sometimes that is very severely abused for nuclear projects. The timeline to failure of nuclear projects outlasts election cycles. And so, for elected officials who promote the construction of nuclear projects, those projects are never completed before they are out of office. So there's little accountability in terms of the decisions that get made. And then in the end, ratepayers and taxpayers must pay our bills, or else we get our power shut off, or we can get fines or go to prison for not paying our taxes. So in effect, the nuclear construction projects are almost always essentially sort of backstopped by the ratepayers or the taxpayers. Go to the next slide. So you see the typical finance models used for U.S. nuclear power plants all involve essentially the public footing the bill. Almost all reactors in the U.S. have been built with a version of essentially ratepayer finance called construction work in progress. There have been repeated bailouts of utilities' bad debts on nuclear projects. The federal government for the last almost 20 years has provided essentially low interest loans called loan guarantees that essentially allow for the project to default on the loans, and the taxpayers will essentially absorb that. We're now providing tax rebates for nuclear energy projects, whether through investment tax credits or production tax credits. Several states have created instruments called zero emissions credits that are being used to subsidize existing reactors that have become unprofitable. And then there's sort of a longer trend of essentially what are above market rate power contracts that nuclear power plant owners have entered into with utilities or large consumers that are often backstopped again by ratepayers or taxpayers. Next slide. But in the last 4 years, through primarily two pieces of legislation, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, with the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and the Inflation Reduction Act, there's been a large amount of public investment authorized for nuclear power plants. The last time something like this was done was in 2005 with the Energy Policy Act that essentially underwrote what was pitched as a nuclear renaissance after 2005. But in which out of 30 reactors that were planned and proposed in that wave, only 2 were actually built and completed. All the rest have been canceled or indefinitely suspended. And so out of the $27.5 billion of public investment that was authorized in 2005, probably about $15.5 billion of that will have actually been spent because, again, there are only 2 reactors that were built. Today we have a series of investments, most of them actually to subsidize existing nuclear power plants that have been operating on average for well over 40 years. There's the Civil Nuclear Credit Program with $6 billion in subsidies for reactors that are imminently to close because they're unprofitable. Advanced reactor demonstration projects that the Department of Energy is subsidizing. And then there are 2 or 3 regional hydrogen hub projects that involve production of hydrogen in nuclear power plants. The Inflation Reduction Act included a much larger group of subsidies for existing reactors, the production tax credit of up to $15 a megawatt hour, and also loan guarantees for upgrading existing energy infrastructure. And so between those two, we estimate up to almost $100 billion could be spent before 2032. For new reactors, there are the clean energy production and investment tax credits, which also apply to renewables and storage and other zero emission types of resources, and also another loan guarantee program. And so out of those, we expect about $13 billion would go to new reactor projects. And that's really only limited by the fact that there are just so few new reactors that are even being proposed right now, and that would be proposed before that program, the tax credit program expires, can completely phased out after 2035. There's also investments in other related infrastructure, such as production of what's called, high assay, low enriched uranium fuel for a number of these new reactor designs, and the hydrogen production tax credit, which the nuclear industry is intent upon being able to cash in on. In fact, Constellation has threatened to sue the IRS if its final rules on that program do not allow existing nuclear reactors to qualify for those credits. But in total, about $140 billion has been authorized through these two pieces of legislation. The vast majority of that probably going to existing reactors rather than building new zero emission energy sources, and only about $16 billion going to new reactors. Next slide. So in terms of the new reactors proposed, all of these are now federally sponsored in some way, in addition to those public investments. Either the Department of Energy is giving land to allow reactors to be built in places where you don't have to get siting approval from states or local communities. And then there are a number of state policies and programs that have started up in the wake of the passage of those recent federal investments by states hoping to be able to cash in on this nuclear bonanza that's being predicted. Next slide. This follows a trend in the last decade of state government subsidies to existing reactors, essentially to slow down the closures of uneconomical nuclear power plants that are basically not able to compete with renewables and the other energy sources on the grid. We now have 92 of those older reactors that are still operating, which was a net down from 104 in 2012. There are two that in California, the Diablo Canyon reactors, that there's a proposal to extend those rather than close them, but only until 2030 at this point. And then there are 9 announced closures of reactors that were averted by these state level subsidies, and those are listed there. And then so together with the federal subsidies and the state subsidies, about $90 billion in direct subsidies to existing nuclear power plants. Again, this is not investing in new energy generation to help with decarbonization. It's going to keep existing power plants online. Next slide. So this details the existing state subsidies. Again, these are not long-term climate investments at this point. All of these programs expire before 2030. And as I indicated on the previous slide, the federal subsidies also end in the early to mid 2030s. Next slide. There are some additional state subsidy programs. Since the first wave of them were passed, though, there was one in Ohio that was repealed actually after it was enacted, because it was enacted through a $61 million corruption scandal. And Illinois enacted a smaller bailout for 6 additional reactors before the new federal investments were authorized. And now Michigan is kicking in $300 million towards a subsidy to restart the closed Palisades reactor. And just recently, just in the last week, there's been a package of $2.8 billion in federal subsidies and investments that have been authorized for that particular project. Next slide. So sorry, and that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Again, that was Tim Judson. And that takes us to our 4th and final speaker, Naomi Oreskes. Go ahead, Naomi.
Thank you. Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you. And I'd like to use this chance to just give some historical context that helps us understand why we should be deeply skeptical of claims that nuclear power is a solution to climate change. And the short summary of that is that the industry has a long history of overpromising and underdelivering. So unlike many technical innovations that are genuinely new, we know a lot about nuclear power. This is an industry with a long, well-documented history, going back to the first civilian power plant in 1954. And what we know, as I just said, is that it has a 70-year history of overpromising and underdelivering on production, on time to completion, and on cost. So if we look first at production, we see that back in the 1950s, nuclear boosters created a technological imaginary of a nuclear future that would include practically everything, the grid, of course, but also airplanes, submarines, aircraft carriers, houses, even nuclear automobiles. Well, we got the submarines and the aircraft carriers, but the nuclear contribution to the grid never exceeded 21% of total electricity produced. Last year, it was 18.6. As you heard from Amory, globally, it's 9%. Now, this isn't trivial. It's been a significant contribution, but it's not remotely what the boosters promised. If we look at projections from the past, and thanks to Professor Ramana for this really instructive slides, we see that all kinds of organizations from the AEC, now the DOE, to the IAEA, made predictions for how much nuclear capacity we would have had by the year 2000 that were many, many times in excess of what actually occurred. The only sustained exception to this overall trend is France. It's the only major economy in the world to have consistently produced the lion's share of its electricity from nuclear. It peaked at 72% in 2018. Now it's around 65%. But it's really important for people to understand how that was achieved. It was achieved, and to use a French word for a French phenomena, in a dirigiste manner, that is to say, in a centralized decision-making, essentially by fiat, in a nationalized nuclear industry linked to a nationalized electricity industry, with the government choosing and enforcing the winning design. So it's hard to see how that could be a model for the United States. If we look at time to completion, we see a similar pattern. The US average time to completion, again, as we've heard, is hovering around 20 years. If we look at the most recent nuclear plants built in the United States, the Vogtle reactors in Georgia, construction began, sorry, I'm having a problem with these little pictures of people blocking my slides. There we go. Thank you. Construction began in 2009. 2 units were scheduled for completion in 2016 and 27. Unit 3 came online in 2023. Unit 4 came online this year, essentially twice as long as promised. Now, in most industries, if you know anything about the history of business or technology, you know that in general, the time to build things decreases as the industry matures. But this has not been the case with nuclear power. As we heard, what we see in the nuclear industry is what appears to be a form of negative learning. And then if we look at cost, well, most of us are familiar with the claims from the 1950s that nuclear power would be too cheap to meter, as free as the unmetered air. The reality is that nuclear power has consistently been the most expensive form of electrical power in the United States, and construction has repeatedly been characterized by huge cost overruns. Some of you may be old enough to remember WHOOPS, the Washington Public Power Supply System in the 1980s. It declared bankruptcy after defaulting on $2 billion worth of bonds. At the time, it was the largest municipal default in US history. Time magazine called the damage incalculable, in part because the bonds had been pitched to retirees as safe investments. And of the 5 proposed reactors in that program, only 1 was ever completed. Now, that was many decades ago, but the situation has not improved. Vogtle 3 and 4, the original certified cost was supposed to be $14 billion. The actual cost was $37, so well more than twice as much. In fact, these are the most expensive power plants ever built, and nearly all these costs get passed on to the consumer. Now, again, in most industries, costs come down over time, but not nuclear power. Despite being a very old technology, costs remain stubbornly high. So what does this mean for consumers? Well, you saw some numbers on costs before, but according to a 2024 report by Lazard on the levelized cost of power, nuclear comes in now around $190 per kilowatt hour. This is 3, 4, 5, 6 times as much as the alternatives. So how do nuclear advocates get around this fact that nuclear power is just incredibly expensive? Well, here's what the Breakthrough Institute says. Quote, a key goal of advanced nuclear is to bring the capital cost down. Well, sure, we would all like that, but how? I think it's important for us to realize that although past performance is no guarantee, in most domains in life, it actually is the best guide we have. And then they go on to say something even more remarkable. They say, quote, the bottom line is that it doesn't matter what a technology costs. Well, I think most consumers would disagree. And as we've heard, money spent on nuclear is money not spent on safer, faster, more desirable alternatives. So the fact is, nuclear power has never been cost competitive in any market-based system. So why hasn't the price come down as it has for PV and nearly every other technology in history? Well, I think there are a lot of reasons, but I think the main one is that it is an intrinsically dangerous technology. Whether you build a large light water reactor or a small modular one, you still face the risk of catastrophic failure. So you have to build in what engineers call defense in depth, multiple costly safety systems. And small reactors don't eliminate that risk. In fact, they may compound it. This is why the federal government agreed in 1957 to indemnify the fledgling industry against the lion's share of costs of a major accident, because the industry itself recognized how risky this technology was and would not pursue it without government backup. So this was one of the many subsidies that this industry has received over 70 years. And one of the other big ones is waste disposal. So this is the issue that I have followed closely since I was in graduate school in the 1980s. So it was really hard for me to just make one slide about this, but I'll just say a few things as I then wrap up. All of these costs we have been discussing, the $190 per kilowatt hour, do not include waste disposal. And that's in part because the US government assumed responsibility for waste disposal under the 1982 Nuclear Waste Policy Act. This created a fund paid for by fees imposed on nuclear utilities to cover costs associated with building and maintaining a repository. The Department of Energy spent $15 billion and more than 20 years attempting to develop Yucca Mountain as that repository, but it failed. And this put the government out of compliance with the law. And so the industry, reasonably enough, sued. So far, the nuclear power industry has been paid $8 billion in cash directly from the US Treasury, and the DOE estimates that the total cost will be at least $32 billion, and some estimates go almost twice as high as that. And meanwhile, 86,000 metric tons of dangerous spent fuel is sitting at 75 sites around this country. Finally, I want to raise one more thing that we haven't talked about this evening, and which is almost never discussed by the advocates of nuclear power, and that's water. Nuclear power requires huge amounts of water. And as we all know, population growth, particularly in the West and the Southwest, is already stressing water resources. Climate change will only make this worse. So it's particularly ironic to suggest nuclear power as an answer to climate change. Thank you for your time.
Thank you again. That was Naomi Oreskes, and that takes us to the Q&A portion of the call. So if you wish to ask a question, you can use the raise your hand function on the bottom of your Zoom window, and you'll be unmuted when it's your turn to ask a question. As a reminder, the Q&A period is reserved for members of the media. If you're having any issues with your audio or the raise your hand function, you can definitely use the text-based Q&A box, and we'll do our best to get to those questions as well. And then before we begin, I do want to mention that there will be a video recording of this event available online later today. There is a link in the news advisory, but if you don't see that, you can contact Max Carlin at 703-276-3255. Again, that's 703-276-3255. Okay, let's see. Our first question is coming from Zachary Sontag at the Casper Star Tribune. Zachary, please unmute yourself.
Hi there. Thanks, panel, for the discussion. It's been really great. I'm hoping that some of the members can speak specifically to a project that's of interest to my readership. It is the TerraPower small modular reactor, which is set to replace a coal-fired power plant in Wyoming. And here we hear from advocates that the defense in depth issue has been addressed by major technological improvements, including using sodium-cooled technology rather than water, as well as some other upgrades. I'm curious if any of the panelists are familiar with this project and if they can speak more specifically to what sets it apart and why it may be worse and or less than others.
I can start. Sodium-cooled reactors have been around for, 60, 70 years. I believe every one that's been built in the world has suffered sodium leaks or fires. There's a good review of this by NRDC, Natural Resources Defense Council, a few years ago. I actually doubt this one is going to get built. It's impossible to evaluate the safety because there's no design, but there are some advantages and some big disadvantages to the sodium cooling in principle. I don't think there's any business case for it. I doubt it will make money, and I think Mr. Gates will lose his money, and the taxpayers will lose a great deal more. I'm sure Ramana and others have a lot more to say about this, as you've written on it too.
Sure. I'll just add to that. I mean, in addition to the challenges of dealing with sodium, because sodium is a very difficult material. It interacts poorly with air and water. So anytime there's a leak, there's a problem. But also reactors like the natrium have other accident modes. In particular, there is something called the core disassembly accident, that when the reactor, something starts melting down, the reactivity can actually increase. And that is a huge problem. And this is one of the reasons why many of the breeder reactors, sodium-cooled fast breeder reactors that have been built around the world have involved fairly significant containments, and that means a very high expense. So there's a number of safety challenges which are unique to sodium-cooled fast reactors.
One other we should mention is that there was a paper in Science magazine this summer by Kemp et al. Showing that the HALEU fuel that this reactor calls for, if it were available, would be directly weapons usable. That was not realized until quite recently.
Wow.
Okay, thank you. Follow-up, Zach?
No, not off the top of my head. That's some good context. I did have an additional question for Tim Judson related to some of the figures. I'm wondering if there is a fact sheet for the total summation of some of the figures you state, including state subsidies, DOE spending from different legislative efforts and so forth. Is that something that?
Yeah, I can share a policy memo as well as a spreadsheet that has the numbers tabulated as well. And what I'd also add regarding the TerraPower Natrium project proposed for Wyoming is that it's I mean, first of all, they're very far from beginning construction on that facility. The TerraPower submitted a construction permit application only this year. It usually takes at least 2 years for the NRC to review and approve those. And what's also really uncertain about that project is essentially what the cost is going to be and who's going to pay for it. There's been a lot of talk about sort of a memorandum of understanding between TerraPower and the local utility company, Rocky Mountain Power, but they haven't actually signed a power contract yet. And in the most recent sort of cost estimates for the project put it probably in excess of twice as expensive as the new reactors at Plant Vogtle in Georgia. And so it's just very uncertain, sort of how expensive the power from that reactor would be, and whether there would be anyone willing to buy it.
I believe Bill Gates has said it'll end up costing over $10 billion. I would think considerably more.
Okay, thank you, Zachary. Let's see here. Just going to take a couple questions coming in here. Actually, let's go ahead and take Alexis Wace from Bloomberg is our next question. Again, we're reserving the Q&A period for members of the media. Okay, Alexis, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Okay, hi there. Thank you all again for your time. I've just been lately been following, the Biden administration's push toward nuclear, especially when it comes to, fueling data centers and just fueling this industry that's taking up so much energy. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on, how much of a benefit is there actually there in using nuclear power to fuel data centers in comparison to, some of the downsides, like the tons of waste it could potentially produce, or even just the amount of energy it could take off of the grid from consumers.
My reaction to a similar written question is that I think this is the most pro-nuclear federal administration in history. And I think that commitment is based on theology, if you like, rather than sound analysis. They publish a great deal of unsound analysis, not of the standard that we are accustomed to from the same agencies. And I don't quite know what will change that other than market reality intruding after enormous amounts of money and time have been wasted.
Yeah, I mean, I'll sort of add to that. I think you already alluded to the problems that are going to be resulting from using existing nuclear plants to fuel this. In particular, when you're trying to revive old nuclear plants, you have to be especially concerned about the risk of accidents. In general, the highest risks of accidents tend to be either when the plant has just started or when the plant is quite old. It's usually called a bathtub curve, the rate of failures. And so when you're thinking about old nuclear plants, I think you should be especially concerned about that. And you're absolutely right. This is taking electricity off the grid, or this, if indeed nuclear power is supposed to be contributing a certain percentage to the grid, then diverting some of that to these data centers is diverting power. It's going to also require water, and it's going to be producing radioactive waste.
No, the data center thing is a whole other conversation we don't have time for here, but there are about 10 layers of fallacy in it. I can tell you that as somebody who has designed super efficient data centers, and both the assessment of how much they could use and how much they can be designed not to use is a very rich conversation I hope will come up in the next few months.
Thank you, everybody. Let's see here. All right, just as a quick reminder for folks who may have joined in a little late, you can pose a question by using the raise your hand function on the Zoom window. And you can also enter a text-based question using the Q&A box. And we are reserving the Q&A for members of the media. We see some good questions, though we might take those as well from non-media. But let's go ahead and take a follow-up question coming from Zachary Sontag at the Casper Star Tribune. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Zachary.
Thanks a lot. So in addition to the points about the cost and the way that this is not a solution to climate change, I'm just curious if this is across the board a categorical rejection from the panel, or is there in anyone's mind here a role for pursuing nuclear at a federal level or otherwise in any capacity? Anything redeeming here?
Well, I can say something about that. I mean, I think it's important to point out that the federal government has pursued nuclear. We've spent, hundreds of billions, maybe $1 trillion on this technology. So we've been there, done that. We've tried it. And I wouldn't say that it was necessarily wrong to have gone down that path in 1954. I mean, that's a really complicated question that had a lot of political and global considerations involved in those decisions. But we've tried it. We've been there, we've done that, and it hasn't really worked. Super expensive, hard to build, dangerous, people don't like it. So, I don't know about you, but it seems to me that most of us think we should learn from experience, and we should take those experiences and not make the same mistakes. So to go back and say, oh, let's try it all again with a promise of a technology that supposedly makes all these problems go away. But as we've just heard about the sodium reactors, as I've emphasized with the nuclear waste. And what's really struck me is how much the boosters really just think they can just wave their hands. So I was in North Dakota recently, in which I talked to the director of the state energy agency, who was saying that North Dakota was going to move forward with nuclear power. And I said, well, what is your plan for the nuclear waste, since we don't have a federal repository? And he said, oh, my understanding is that the new designs don't produce waste. And I was like, well, only if the laws of physics change. I mean, conservation of mass is a little hard to get around. So, there's a kind of, I think someone used the term magical thinking, and I think that's true. Now, that said, there is a kind of nuclear that I do think the federal government should continue to study and research, which is fusion. I think the odds of that being a significant contribution anytime in my lifetime are small. We've also been working on nuclear fusion since 1943, but nevertheless, because if we had it, it could be transformative. I think it still makes sense to do the basic scientific research, but yeah, Amory would probably disagree.
I would see it as a magnificent science project, but I don't see any way to make it economic.
I think that's probably true, but the other thing is the research is cheap, right? So you could do the research and it would do very little harm. But when you commit to building out a technology that is too expensive and will cause big delays in a climate crisis where you don't have time or money to waste, that to me is a gigantic error.
Yeah, I'll add to that, as somebody who occupies an academic space, I know lots of, my colleagues and elsewhere will be interested in the grants that come with this. And so they all benefit from it and their graduate students and so on and so forth. But if it's just a pure R&D thing, that's a smaller ask. It's because you start building all these reactors that the ask becomes much larger. But of course, you should also ask the question, even that R&D, is there an opportunity cost? I mean, all these really smart graduate students, why shouldn't they be working on things which are going to actually be saving us from the climate crisis?
True, but it would keep a few physicists off the street.
Great, thank you. Let's see, we had a hand raised from Aaron Larson at Power Magazine. Aaron, did you still have a question to ask?
Well, my question was going to be around fusion, actually, and you guys have already addressed that, so that's why I took my hand down.
Okay. Thank you, Aaron. We're going to take our next question from Vivian Marks at Nature. She says, apologies, back to data centers and AI. Forgive the platitude and scenario question. You're at a conference, let's say it's chemists or life scientists getting coffee, and fall into conversation with a scientist thrilled about AI tools, but worried about carbon footprint, also related to AI tools they want to embrace. How should they avoid magical thinking as they plan their future, say, for exascale computing projects?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I'll jump in that. I think, one of the things that's hard about all these issues, and one reason I'm such a great fan of all the people on this panel, because of the way they've been able to integrate these different aspects of a really complicated problem. But fundamentally, this gets down to the fact that we do not pay the true cost of energy because we don't pay for the negative externalities. That is to say, the cost of climate change, the cost of other environmental damage. So ultimately, the only solution to this, I think, is some kind of pricing system that puts a price on the social cost of carbon, which would raise the cost of energy and might make the people who organize and manage those data centers have to think harder about how they do it. And this is where Amory's important work, of course, comes in. If power is cheap, and especially if someone else is paying for a big chunk of it, say through federal subsidies, then you can be lazy about how you run your operation. But when power is expensive, you have to be smarter and you have to be more efficient. So I think ultimately we have to have some kind of price on carbon that forces Microsoft and all the data centers and all the people who are now gobbling up huge amounts of energy to rethink what their business model is. And I think it's really about that. It's not about the individual scientist saying, oh, should I or should I not use AI?
I think there are a lot of basic questions unanswered or fraught with confusions about what AI might be good for. It's not intelligent, and whether it has itself a business case or is simply a very large bubble with some uses, but not nearly enough to give a good return to the enormous investments going into it. But I can say a little bit about how guilty your hypothetical scientists should feel about using it, because I think help is on the way, and there's history behind this. 2010 to 2018, the amount of data center computing done in, I believe it's the world, rose by 550%, and the electricity they used to do that rose by 6.5%. In other words, the efficiency gains almost completely offset the growth in activities. The last data center design I worked on, we only were able to triple the efficiency at normal construction cost, but our partner EDS said that had the client followed our advice, they would have saved 95% of the energy and half the capital cost. Now, if you look at the NVIDIA website, you will be startled about 2 to 4 orders of magnitude gains in system efficiency in each generation of their chips and firmware. That's already happened, and a lot more like that on the way. Altogether, there's at least 2, probably 3, maybe more orders of magnitude efficiency opportunity in data centers just by better design and especially software.
Great, thanks, Amory. All right, well, we are definitely running over time, but we do want to make sure that everyone knows where to get more information or connect with folks after today's press briefing. To connect with today's speakers or to get more information about Ramana's new book, Nuclear is Not the Solution, The Folly of Atomic Power in the Age of Climate Change, you can contact Max Carlin at 703-276-3255. There is a link to information about the book in the news advisory, and we also dropped that link in the chat earlier. Let's see here.
Could I ask for, since it's in the written Q&As, can you say anything about where people can get a recording or a transcript of this program and perhaps copies of slides?
Yeah, absolutely. You can contact Max Carlin to get any of that. Most people probably got an email from me already. We do have a bit.ly link in the news advisory as well, and that's going to be redirected to the HD version of this video recording after the file is done rendering. So that'll be available a little later.
And can you put that Max Carlin in the chat so people have the coordinates, please?
Yeah, sure.
Thanks. Yeah. Of course, we would love any reactions, especially criticisms and corrections from any of you, so we can keep improving our work.
Thanks, Amory. I'm dropping my coordinates in the chat. But for everyone who participated with us, we do thank you for joining us today, and that will conclude our news event.